I got a question like on 2 months ago, so I'm finally getting to that now, or at least to this question. There's a bunch of others that I still need to get to. Um, it's been pretty busy and exciting in the new office. You can see it's kind of empty with papers around. But the question I got is more like a series of questions, and the overlying concept or the idea of the questionnaire, I would say, is of the questionnaire is SmO2 levels. And the first part is SmO2 like baseline or resting levels and what those mean. I think I've talked about this in some of the videos, or at least hinted at it. Generally, I don't do much with those, even though I think there might be something there with like fiber types and mitochondrial density. But I'm really not sure. And one of the big things with resting levels is that at resting levels, or when you're resting, your entire system's function at a very low rate. So you have low oxygen consumption in your muscles and you have low cardiac output. And since that's a muscle supply and demand, and you're measuring with NIRS, you end up getting very small changes in either of the two. So in what your muscle's doing with the oxygen or what you're supplying, is going to have a large physiological noise effect, which you'll see. So generally, you can get quite a bit of variation. This doesn't happen as much when you're exercising because the system all kind of gets going. So your cardiac output goes up and your consumption of oxygen, the muscles go up, so that these kind of little noise things, they don't play out, or they don't create such a big difference. So the whole thing becomes a little robuster. So with resting based on levels, we really don't do that much, but it has lots to do with just uncertainty. On that was the question a little bit, well, is SmO2 like the level or the baseline or the rest value that you have, does that have something to do with basal metabolic rate? Which I understand where that rationale is coming from, because you think you have an arterial oxygenation level, and you have the difference from the arterial oxygenation, what you're measuring with your pulse oximeter, and what you're measuring with your NIRS device. And you're like, well, that's an oxygen consumption, which is related to energy production and expenditure. This is kind of this AV difference. Technically, if you could quantify the measures, I think you could relate that to basal metabolic rate, but we're again stuck to the fact that NIRS just is a relative measure, and so you don't really know how much oxygen is actually being consumed. So you make the assumption, well, a lower SmO2 value at rest is a higher arteriovenous difference, and now that seems to generally be true probably under exercise. So at max intensity, if you push lower SmO2 values, you have a higher VO2 max. At least they correlate. That could arguably due to, I think, a higher AV difference. At least that would make sense. But at rest, I really don't think that's possible. At least I don't see any evidence for it. Maybe you can, but I'm not convinced by that yet. You'd have to see if somehow there's correlations there, maybe. So that's to like the resting values and baseline values. The question goes then on to what I would say the hyperemia effect. So if you start exercising, you get increase in muscle oxygenation, and which is usually a result of blood flow, and again, it's hyperemia that you see. And why does that happen? It happens to different degrees in different people. So generally why hyperemia happens, there's some debate around that. But from a NIRS perspective, we see nicely that this happens. You get hyperemia responses as your muscle oxygenation goes up. But what is true is that when you warm up, you're doing warm-ups with different athletes, you have very different responses, and different athletes respond very differently to different warm-up protocols. Which might mean that you need to individualize your warm-up protocol. You could draw that conclusion. But why is this happening? Why do these different people have these different hyperemia responses? And the answer is obviously that I don't know. But if you read, there's a whole series of publications by Russ Richardson on hyperemia, so exercise-induced hyperemia. And kind of two of the things that kind of come out about a bunch of those series of papers is that, well, first of all, cardiac output is very important. in the hyperemia response. The hyperemia response is linked to a cardiac output response. So when your heart rate and your stroke volume go up and you start to pump more blood, that's going to have an effect on hyperemia. It makes a lot of sense, of course. So the conclusion of that might be that, well, depending on how strong your cardiac output is, you're going to have more or less of a hyperemia response. Maybe. The second point also, though, out of those papers is that the hyperemia response that's driven by this cardiac output is linked to peripheral movement response. So basically, by moving a limb, there's a afferent neuronal response that links back or somehow sends message back to the central system about what's going on, and that's then linked directly to this cardiac output response. So somehow there's a link there. It also makes sense, again, if the movement or the performance is coming from a limb, so from the periphery, there needs to be some communication of the central system back that, hey, I need oxygen, energy, and blood. If you look at that, then, well, then depending on your limb activity, your peripheral activity, that's going to kind of underscore this cardiac output response, which is the main effect of hyperemia. So it's not likely not just a cardiac output response, in that the better cardiac output you have, the higher the hyperemia response, or the more clear the hyperemia response, however we're going to use the words for that. It has some link to do with what the periphery is doing. So the statement that I said before, that your higher hyperemia response might be linked to strong cardiac output, that might be true, but it'll also just be linked to the activity that you're doing as well. Obviously, those things are going to be linked. So you may very well, then the response that some athletes have to kind of slow-paced warm-up versus some kind of interval-based warm-up might be a peripheral response to the type of activity that they're doing, and which then links everything to kind of so basically, I don't really know. That's the end response, but at least with these Ross Richardson's papers, however the periphery is structured, you're getting a response to your central system that is going to give a cardiac output response that will affect hyperemia. If you do different types of peripheral movement to elicit this response, it's reasonable that maybe different types of peripheral movement may have different types of effect on messaging to your cardiac output system. That meaning that it's not just the capacity of your cardiac output system that's going to affect this hyperemia, but the actual messaging that the system's getting from the periphery. That's what I'm trying to say. Which is interesting, especially from a very applied sense on like how do I do my warm-ups? If my warm-up is a high SmO2 is good, so higher muscle oxygenation value is good, and I want to elicit that, I have to figure out how I do that. The question then after is, well, is this saying something about how well trained someone is for a specific type of exercise? That might have something to do with it. I hope that kind of gets started into the questions that this person asked and into some debate, because I think it's interesting. So you can leave a comment or something, and I can try to dig into some more literature and do a better job explaining than I did here. This is more about it's an interesting thing to talk about. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.